The confrontation between congressional Democrats and the Trump administration over the Mueller report has escalated. The House Judiciary Committee is debating whether to hold Attorney General William Barr in contempt of Congress. Well, this comes after he defied a subpoena to provide the special counsel's unredacted report. But ahead of today's vote, President Trump asserted executive privilege to block the release of that report. Here's how Judiciary Chairman Jerry Nadler addressed the news.
The administration has announced loud and clear that it does not recognize Congress as a co-equal branch of government with independent constitutional oversight authority, and it will continue to wage its campaign of obstruction. When the administration says it will oppose all subpoenas, presumably regardless of its merits, it is saying that it does not recognize Congress having a constitutional oversight authority over the executive branch. No person, and certainly not the top law enforcement officer in the country, can be permitted to flout the will of Congress and to defy a valid subpoena. No person, not the Attorney General, not the President, can be permitted to be above the law. That is what is at stake today.
Joining me now, Nancy Cordes on Capitol Hill and Rebecca Roiphe here on set. Nancy, I want to start with you first. When we're looking at this, remind us how we got to this point.
Session this morning in the House Judiciary.
Well, there's been a standoff between the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, Jerry Nadler, and the Attorney General, William Barr, over a couple of very key issues. One was the Attorney General's decision not to testify before the Judiciary Committee last week, in part because of a disagreement over the format. The chair wanted both lawmakers and staffers be able to ask the Attorney General questions. That was kind of an unusual arrangement, and so the Attorney General ended up pulling out at the last minute. But beyond that, the bigger issue is the fact that Democratic leaders, and the Judiciary Committee chair is certainly one of them, want to see the full unredacted Mueller report, and they don't believe that the stipulations that have been laid out by the Justice Department over that would guide how they could look at this report are fair. Right now, the Attorney General is saying that a very small number of congressional leaders can look at the unredacted report behind closed doors. They can only discuss it amongst each other. So the rest of the members of the House Judiciary Committee, there are some 40 of them, would not be able to view the report. And Democrats feel that that is unreasonable. And so they say if the Department of Justice won't relent, then they are going to make an example of the Attorney General and hold him in contempt of Congress.
So what were the arguments, Nancy, that the Republicans and Democrats were making about holding him in contempt?
Well, Republicans are saying, look, the Attorney General has actually done everything that he's required by law to do, and then some, that he very quickly released a redacted version of the Mueller report. He didn't need to do that, they say. And he agreed to testify before the House Judiciary Committee one day after testifying before the Senate committee, but only pulled out because Democrats were making unreasonable demands about him being questioned by staffers. Democrats argue that precedent has been set. Over the past 100 years, Congress has had the right to view reports like this, like the one done by the special counsel, after they're completed. And they say, there's never been a problem with members being able to view classified material as long as it is safeguarded. And so they say that the only reason that the Attorney General is drawing such a hard line now is because he's being directed by the president to do so. And obviously that argument is being reinforced, they say, by the fact that the White House is now saying that rather than provide these members of Congress what they want and access to the unredacted version of the Mueller report, that the White House is going to go ahead and assert executive privilege over the whole thing.
I want to go to you, Rebecca. Tell me if I have this right. This concept of executive privilege really came out of the Watergate time period.
Right. I mean, it's not explicitly in the Constitution. You're absolutely right about that. There's sort of been some pointing to maybe some precedents for it. But when it got really articulated was in the Nixon case, where the special counsel was trying to get a hold of those tapes, which ended up really being the beginning of the end of the Nixon administration. So part of what's interesting is they recognize the principle, this idea that the executive has an interest in been keeping some kinds of top-level conversations private, and that's part of its constitutional role. It needs that in order to carry on its constitutional role. On the flip side, the court at the same time said that privilege is limited. It's limited by congressional powers as well. So Congress also has a valid oversight role. So what Nixon was trying to do, the case, was really strike a balance to say, look, we have these co-equal branches. We want them to be able to operate as they're supposed to be operating, but we want there to be oversight. And so there's kind of inevitably going to be some kind of sparring because the court has just recognized both of these powers that necessarily run up right into each other. And so that's kind of part and parcel of government, and we see it in every administration. There's some back and forth fighting over some executive privilege issue. So
we know at one point former White House advisor Steve Bannon tried to exert executive privilege. I mean, how far does executive privilege go? Is it every conversation the president has had with anybody, from advisors to attorneys to whatever?
Right. So part of the problem is that the law on this is a little underdeveloped. So, you have a lot of theories and you have a few data points, a few cases in which they've been, there's sort of efforts to give contours to what exactly the executive privilege is. But what we do know is that, it can be kind of broad. It can be a broad assertion, but it's got serious limitations. And so the question here is, if they exert the privilege, what would a court say? And part of the problem here is that the idea is, well, why do you need those things private? And Nixon, the administration was just like, we don't want to give them over. It's like a generalized confidentiality. And the courts are not going to accept that. They're going to say, come on, tell us really what's so important that you can't turn this over. And part of the issue here is it's such a tiny amount of the report. Most of the report's already been turned over. So how can you really say we have such a great confidentiality interest in this tiny little subset of information when we gave over all of this other information? Maybe they could make that argument.
Do you think this could go as far as to the Supreme Court?
Yeah, I think it could. I mean, I think part of what's happened here is that normally these things get worked out between the two branches. It's just kind of a negotiation. And I think what we're witnessing here across a number of issues, a number of things that have come up, are those norms have broken down. So there seems to be no real ability to communicate and find some kind of compromise. And so if there's no compromise, then this is what happens. Barr gets held in contempt. They go to court to try to enforce that contempt order, and then that gets appealed. And it could get appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court.
Nancy, we know Republicans have repeatedly defended Barr for making a good faith effort to share as much as he could of the Mueller report. I want to play for you what White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders had to say earlier.
I think it's so absurd, this idea that Congress doesn't get to see the Mueller report. In fact, there's a less redacted version of the Mueller report sitting there waiting on them to come and look at it. Not a single Democrat has even taken the time to go and look at it. They're asking for information they know they can't have. The Attorney General is actually upholding the law. Chairman Nadler, take a minute to let this sink in. Chairman Nadler is asking the Attorney General of the United States to break the law and commit a crime by releasing information that he knows he has no legal authority to have. It's truly outrageous and absurd what the chairman is doing, and he should be embarrassed that he's behaving this way.
Nancy, we know that Barr has offered a dozen members of Congress, 6 Democrats, 6 Republicans, to access the report with most of the redactions removed. Nancy, do you think, why is it you think the Democrats have taken this wait and see on the report instead of actually accepting that offer?
Well, because they say they don't want the Attorney General picking and choosing what they see from the Mueller report. They say in previous cases, it has been a matter of routine for the Attorney General to go to a judge and ask for the authority to provide this underlying evidence and classified information to Congress. They say just look at the Hillary Clinton investigation, for example. In that case, the Department of Justice had no trouble handing over classified material, FBI interviews, to the Judiciary Committee for review, even knowing that some of that information could potentially end up winding its way into the public. So they say that the White House now, by insisting that it's against the law for the Attorney General to hand over this information, really is ignoring about a century of precedents here.
You agree, Rebecca?
I do agree. I mean, I think that the point, I was a little confused by Sarah Huckabee Sanders' point about it being illegal. Certainly, if they were to just demand 6E, which is the grand jury material, without going through the court, that might be problematic. But what they're asking Attorney General Barr to do is join them in a request to the court for that material and to turn over the other materials that were redacted on other bases. So there's nothing really illegal about what he's doing. There's just, it's just Congress exerting its powers and the White House exerting its powers, and what we're seeing is the two branches increasingly being unable to work with one another.
I mean, the divide between Democrats and Republicans is just so incredible at this point.
It is.
Before you go, I do want to ask you, Rebecca, any potential Mueller, special counsel Robert Mueller, if he were to come to testify, the exertion of executive privilege, how would that affect his testimony?
Well, I mean, it's complicated again, because if he comes to testify, he will come to testify as a former government official, and that is a different position to be in. The government has very limited power over their former aides. So then that has been litigated before, so that if he comes voluntarily, and there's no way, there's First Amendment issues, it's political speech, it's not, the government would have a very hard time saying you can talk about this, but you can't talk about that. So I think ultimately, if that were to happen, that would, it would be easier for him to talk about all of these issues, unless he himself felt somehow bound, either through professional rules or some other sense of obligation to honor the White House's assertion of executive privilege.
Rebecca Roiphe, thank you, and to our chief congressional correspondent, Nancy Cordes, thank you, Nancy, very much.